All right, this time we're going to talk about moments when emotions are raging and you feel out of control. And how can we deal with them constructively? We'll apply our model again to see what's needed. Then we'll learn two groups of techniques that are commonly employed in both religious and secular settings to approach emotions that are raging out of control. Before we begin, we need to address a few concerns. First, we should acknowledge clearly that just because an emotion is negative does not mean it is inappropriate. There is a time for anger, a time for sadness, and even a time for shame. What we're addressing here are times when, for whatever reason, you consider the emotion inappropriate. And I'm just going to define that very loosely as any time the emotion is unwarranted by the particular situation or exaggerated. And you can grasp this just by thinking of a time after which you slapped yourself on the forehead and said, "What was I thinking?" But we can't define inappropriateness too concretely because each tradition and each person is going to have a slightly different concept of what's appropriate, so you need to fill in the blanks a bit here. Second, we should address a certain misconception. Some see any attempt to influence emotions as wrong-headed, a so-called unnatural attempt to intervene in a natural process, quote unquote. Now, this image is common in our culture, but it is an illusion. I mean, think about it. An organism has to react as quickly as possible to potential threats, so it must begin to react based on only the slightest input, perhaps the hint of the outlines of a snake, which may trigger fear. But at the same time, the organism doesn't want to waste energy or opportunities unnecessarily, so it must be able to regulate its reactions as new information comes in, such as the realization upon inspection that the snake is actually only a rope, which reorients from fear to relief and then to calm. Thus, we can see that reappraisal is built into the system as a means of efficient and dynamic responsiveness. We are training ourselves in a natural capacity here. Okay, so how do we deal with emotions that are, in your own estimation, inappropriate to a particular situation? Based on our model, we know that emotions arise out of interpretations of situations. So inappropriate emotions likely arise out of inappropriate interpretations, which in turn initiate physiological response patterns that are inappropriate. The problem is that with raging emotion, the physiological response is quite strong and has considerable momentum. The adrenaline released into your system by fear or anger, for example, has a duration and can't just be turned off like a light switch. Moreover, it actually changes your mind state, narrowing your mental focus so that it's not as simple as just thinking differently. You have to set the right conditions first so that you can think differently. The key is cutting off the source that is sustaining the physiological response. And there are two ways to do that. And these two approaches form the substance of two broad groups of techniques, examples of which are commonplace in traditionally religious practices. I call these two groups narrowing and broadening, and they can be characterized as looking away or looking at, respectively. Okay, narrowing or looking away means narrowing your focus of attention to exclude the disturbing stimuli. For example, if you are reacting to a fearful memory, focusing on the rhythm of the breath or on a mantra instead can push that stimulus out of the focus of attention long enough to effectively break the cycle that is calling for a physiological response of fear. And at that point, it's a matter of letting the leftovers of the fear response run themselves out without renewing them. Such narrowing can provide temporary relief, but it doesn't deal with the root cause of the disturbance, namely problematic interpretations. So, broadening, or looking at, broadening means widening your focus of attention to include the source of disturbance, but within a larger context. For example, when you fail a test and feel a tinge of frustration, but then remember that it's learning from your mistakes that will help you most in the long run, that is an act of broadening. Similarly, a Buddhist may broaden her view to contemplate the impermanence of the ego, which became so invested in the test, while a pagan may consider how the setback resembles winter, which is bitter but always followed by spring. And these are all acts of broadening. It's not always so easy, though. Let's say you feel more than a tinge. You feel crushing frustration. Now, in that state of raging emotion, where your mind is so narrowly focused, it's no simple task to just magically broaden your thinking. What you can do in such a situation is break broadening down into 3 separate steps and focus on the first 2 until you can muster the resolve to attempt the third, which is the broadening itself. Now, the specific steps are noticing, observing, and broadening. First, noticing. Noticing that an emotion is arising. Often we're not aware that emotions are arising until a friend points it out. Why are you raising your voice? And you say, I'm not raising my voice, but you realize, oh, I'm angry. So this is clearly the first necessary step. This is, of course, a matter of common sense, but the key insight here is that you have to be able to notice emotions arising, and that's not easy. So you need to strengthen your mindfulness, that is, your awareness of what is going on in your mind and body at the moment by practicing, so that you are ready when it is needed. Now, in this course, we'll be learning a meditation called mindfulness of the breath, which is very good for that purpose. The second step in the broadening process, after you've noticed that you're having an emotion, is observing. And this is more active than noticing and involves questions like, how intense is this emotion? Is it pleasant or unpleasant? What does it feel like in the body? How is it affecting my perceptions and attitude? You engage with the emotion and bring it further into the light of consciousness, but without judging it. No longer the I that is angry or sad, but simply observing, as if from a third-person perspective. You continue to experience the emotion, but you may begin to feel less caught up in it. And you can spend as much time as you need on this step. Sometimes only a split second is required to let go of a flash of anger, while other times it may take minutes, hours, or even days to relax a smoldering rage. Finally, once noticing and observing have brought you to a point where you are able to proceed further, the third step is the broadening itself. And the essence of it is expanding your awareness beyond the immediate circumstances of the moment to include a larger context. For example, a Buddhist may broaden by taking the metaphorical perspective of the sky. You can see current thoughts and feelings as weather passing through, but you are the sky. What's happening right now is just passing through, and it's not going to be like this forever. In this way, the suffering of the immediate moment is placed into its larger temporal context, in which it is just one impermanent event in a natural flow of all things arising and passing away. Now, different traditions have different techniques for doing this, but they all expand one's view to include a larger, meaningful context. And if you perform these techniques with persistence, just noticing, observing, and then broadening your view, gradually the grip of a raging emotion will begin to loosen. Notice that there's no point in the broadening process where you try to have a specific emotion. Instead, it requires what Taoists call wu-wei, or trying without trying. Without forcing any particular outcome, you simply broaden. And this opens a space in which a more appropriate emotion may arise. This may seem mysterious, but our model reveals why it works. A broadened perspective constitutes a new stimulus, which triggers a new appraisal, and this time, the process is able to respond to a richer, more nuanced, and more contextualized set of input on the situation, leading, hopefully, to a more appropriate emotional outcome. Techniques of broadening like this can be found implicitly or explicitly in almost every religious and philosophical tradition. We've just seen a Buddhist example. A Christian example might relate the current situation to moving passages of Scripture, while a Taoist example might set the situation within the broader yin-yang harmony of nature. Broadening, as outlined here, is really just a more general formulation of these sorts of practices, which tend to occupy central positions in these traditions, and as such, we'll return to broadening again and again in this course. So, in summary, the so-called negative emotions are often appropriate, but sometimes inappropriate. And in those times, we can use our narrowing or looking away, or broadening or looking at, which is accomplished in 3 steps: noticing, observing, and broadening. And this is challenging and requires practice, but it is possible.